Kathleen Osta, who's the Midwest Regional Director for the National Equity Project. She's participated in the development of the Coaching for Equity methodology, which I hope we'll hear about today. She's designed and led professional learning and was responsible for the organization's program development and operational management. She's formerly a social worker in the Chicago Public Schools and was a bilingual kindergarten teacher. Then her colleague Hugh Vasquez is a senior associate at the National Equity Project, where he develops and expands their leadership for equity work. He's worked with hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals to address race, gender, class, and other social divisions. So please welcome Kathleen and Hugh.
Hello. Good morning. It's not a rhetorical thing right there. Good morning. So I learned something new today. One is that there's something in front of us called a confidence monitor. I need one in my office. I am going to introduce myself a bit, and Kathleen will, and we're going to just dig right into this phenomenon called implicit bias. But I want to start by saying that I am here with ancestors and relatives who paved the way for me to be here. I think most of us are, all of us are. In my case, my Mexican grandfather was a revolutionary, and I kind of am proud to be in his footsteps. He actually, at the age of 14, left his home in Mexico and joined Pancho Villa to fight in the revolution. I used to think that was a unique thing until every other Mexican I met said the same thing. Which is probably true, that most of our relatives fought with Pancho Villa if we're in this country now. So I am here because of him and because of many others who came before me, and I'm proud to be standing up here with this. We are going to be focusing on implicit bias. It is one of the most hopeful learnings that has come along in a long time. Hopeful for me in the sense that it has given us some understanding about how race and racism and other isms perpetuate, are produced, maintain themselves through something called implicit bias. It's not something that we understood a long time ago. It's a fairly new understanding. And it's giving hope because it's given us a deeper way to understand what we can do about it. But that in itself, just looking at implicit bias is not sufficient, because we know that we sit in a system that is one made up of oppression. We are in an oppressive system. So if we focus on implicit bias just for understanding our individual selves, things will not change. We have to see it in the context of systemic oppression. And in that sense, understanding implicit bias is in service of changing, transforming our systems around us. And so that is one of the whys why are we doing this? It's so that we can transform our systems, not just for the individual changes that we need to go through.
So I'm Kathleen Osta, and I've been working for and with the National Equity Project for 20 years, first out of our Oakland office, and for the last 4 years based in Chicago. My father moved to Chicago in 1964 to work as a community organizer on the west side of the city, organizing to fight against housing discrimination. And I grew up in a town called Oak Park, which is just west of the city. I lived 2 blocks west of Austin Boulevard. And if anyone knows Chicago, Austin Boulevard is the dividing line between the city and the town of Oak Park. So from my house, I could see the west side of Chicago. And what I could see were vacant lots and schools with broken windows and lots of liquor stores. And I lived in Oak Park, 2 blocks literally from here to the door in the back of the room. And where I lived, our schools were well funded. We had lots of green space and lots of resources, what we call a high opportunity neighborhood. So I grew up with a lot of consciousness about these two worlds. And I also had the sense from a young age that something wasn't right. And I didn't have any language for understanding what that was about, but I knew something wasn't right, and I have spent the last 25 years in my career working for social and racial justice. And yet, when I, about a month ago, went out for a run in my neighborhood, I was running along and I saw a Latina woman walking out of a large brick home. And in an instant, I heard the word house cleaner in my brain. I caught it, and then as I approached and got closer to the house, I realized this woman was absolutely not a housekeeper. She was the homeowner, and she was leaving her home probably for work. Now, my conscious mind knows that Latina women are bankers and doctors and social workers and professors, but my unconscious mind worked more quickly than my conscious mind. And because of the systems that we live in and the ways that the messages that we inhale about people and the people, who people are, my unconscious mind had produced the word house cleaner. So I passed the house and I reflected about how outrageous that is. And here I am, going all different places in the country talking about implicit bias, and I'm going for a run in my own neighborhood and making the assumption that a woman coming out of a house, a Latina woman, couldn't be the homeowner, she's a house cleaner. So that's why it's important that we talk about this, because this is not about our conscious values or our explicit values. This is about what happens in all of our brains. And so the exciting part is we're learning about our brains, and we're learning there are things we can do about it, and that we can actually catch that happening and mitigate against the negative outcomes that can happen when we hold those unconscious biases.
So we want to take off from Kathleen's story. And our work with you this morning for the brief time that we have is to get you engaged and involved in making the invisible visible by looking at our unconscious. And we're going to do this in a couple of ways. One is we're going to do a brief orientation about a few facts about how our brains work, because we want to know what we've learned about our brains so that we can actually understand, how do I go backwards? Understand how our brains are functioning. So here's the iceberg, and we use this metaphor because, as David Brooks puts it, that our unconscious parts of the mind are most of the mind, where most of the decisions and many of the impressive acts of thinking take place. So you notice what's below the waterline with an iceberg. Everybody sees that, right? Most of the iceberg is where? Above or below? It's below. And what we see above is only a tiny part of the iceberg, while our brains and our minds and our unconscious mind is like that. We are looking at what is below the waterline when we're looking at our unconscious mind. Here's a couple of facts about our brain. Our brains process 11 million pieces of information a second. Now think about that for a moment. 11 million bits or pieces of information a second is processed by our brain. Now I know who's out there saying, well, how did they count that? Right? 11 million pieces of information a second. And only 40 to 50 of those pieces of information are conscious. So what does that mean? We're walking around largely unconscious, is what that means. That's exactly what that means. Our unconscious is working faster and in greater depth than our conscious mind. Here are a couple other facts we want you to know, processes about how our brains work. Our brains are meaning-making machines. That's what they're designed to do, to notice what's going on around us, to recognize patterns, to look at what is happening around us so quickly that we make meaning of it. We take in data, it sorts the data, makes meaning of the data, and it's traveling at the speed of light. Very quickly, our unconscious mind is traveling at the speed of light. Our conscious mind is, like we say, taking a slow walk. Our conscious mind is not really recognizing what is going on as quickly as our unconscious mind is. And it's a good thing that it does that. Our unconscious is working because our unconscious mind is what is protecting us. It helps us to survive. The fight, flight, or freeze response is coming from our unconscious mind. If I am walking down the trail, especially in older times, historic times, I'm walking down the trail and I hear some rustling in the bushes going on, and I depend on my conscious mind to go, well, I wonder what that is. Yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah, well, it might be, bam, I'm gone. If I'm counting on my conscious mind. Because that bear, or that wolf, or that whatever is going to get me. If I'm counting on my conscious mind. Instead, I rely on my unconscious to recognize the patterns more quickly than my conscious mind, and it helps me to do fight, flight, or freeze. So we want our conscious mind to be working with us. That's how we have made it this far, is because of our unconscious mind. So we want to take a look at how our brains operate. We form these patterns, and we form these patterns so that we can actually take shortcuts so that we don't have to think everything through consciously before we do them. So we're going to ask you to participate in an activity, an exercise, that helps us all to take a look at how our brains work. And all you have to do is to state the color of the text when you see it. But we're doing this as a group, and we're doing it aloud. So you're not doing it silently. You understand that part, right? So when you see the text, holler out the color of the text all at once. Are you ready? Let's go.
Blue, red, green, black, green, red, blue, black, green, red, blue, black.
What happened? What happened? Now, this is not an IQ test. It's not to measure your ability. This is showing how our brains process. Now, what happened when the color matched the word? You were able to say it quickly. Is that true? What happened when the color did not match the word? You hesitated. Is that right? It was a hesitation. Why is that? Because our brains have been conditioned to match color and word quickly when we see it, but we haven't had as much practice doing it the other way, when the word and the color is different. Fair to say? Got that? That's how our brains are working. It's not that you are any better or worse as a person from having done it like that. It's because our brains operate that way. We form patterns. Our brains make sense of those, and it's our unconscious mind that is making the sense of those. So guess what? We're going to do it again. You ready? Let's see what happens this time.
Blue, red, green, black, green, black, red, green, red, blue, black, green, red, blue, black.
Aha, what happened that time? Proud of yourself? So this is a demonstration that shows how quickly our brains can adapt. What happened in the second time around, even though it was only the second time around, is that you formed synapses already. Synapses that allowed you to do something faster and quicker that you didn't do the first time. The synapse, by the way, if I can get this to work here, the synapse is that bright spot right in the middle there. And this is not a reproductive talk, so this is a picture of a brain synapse going on. But the synapse, when it fires, it forms all those little tentacles out there that produces our ability to do something faster and faster and faster and faster. The first firing has only one, but after hundreds or millions of firings, it produces a lot more, and we can do it faster. You produced a synapse that second time around that allowed you to state the color different than the word faster the second time.
All right, so now we're going to talk about implicit bias, and we're going to talk about 3 processes that produce implicit bias. We're going to take one at a time. So one is called priming, the next is associations, and the third is assumptions. So to get started, we're going to take a look at a video.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
All right. Raise your hand if you had the answer right, the number of passes, that you had 13. All right? Raise your hand if you did not see the moonwalking bear. All right. So what's at play there? You were primed by the narrator to count the number of passes. That's called priming. You weren't primed to look for a moonwalking bear. So your brain was focused, its attention, where you were primed to focus it. So let's make a connection now to implicit bias and actually provide a definition. Implicit bias is the process of associating stereotypes and attitudes toward categories of people without conscious awareness. Okay, so that's the key, and we all do this. That's the piece about this work that can be challenging but is also hopeful. We have to start by acknowledging that we all do this, and then we can do something about it. But the effect of that those unconscious biases that we all hold can result in us taking actions and making decisions that are at odds with our values without even being aware of it.
So here's an example. I want you to think about Kathleen's prime of what's at play here. A number of years ago, I was directing a youth program, and the youth program was one that took 120 teenagers away for a 7-day residential program. I know that sounds crazy now, and I was younger then, to focus on issues of racism, sexism, heterosexism, anti-Semitism, and classism. So we were training very deeply as adults. How can we work with young people on these issues if we don't do our own work? And so we did our own work, intensely looking at ourselves, our own awareness, our own consciousness, our own racism and sexism and so on, in order to be able to work with the young people. On one summer afternoon, this is in Oakland, California, I was driving to lunch, very warm outside, and I had my windows down in my car, and my car was the first car at this one signal light. So I was right at the crosswalk line. It happened to be by a school, a middle school, and there were kids crossing. And over to my right were 3 young African-American boys that started crossing the crosswalk in front of my car. And as they approached, I looked at them and they looked at me, and one of them said, "Go ahead, roll up your window and lock the door." And then he kept on walking by. Now my response in the moment, instantly, was, who do you think you, no. Do you know what I do for a living? Do you know that I'm here on your behalf every day? Or, do you know that, that was my instant response. I was not in my best facilitative mode at that moment as they were walking across. And the 3 of them just kind of looked through the window at me as they were passing, and I was glaring at them, like that. And as they passed and got further, I started to relax a little bit, and I noticed then my hand had moved to the switch. I didn't know it until they had passed. They didn't see my hand as they were looking in the car, but they knew what I was going to do, or at least one of them knew what I was going to do. So the question is, what happened inside my brain that my conscious awareness was not the same as my unconscious? My unconscious moved my hand to the switch. Why is that?
So what's at play there? Hugh's unconscious mind perceived threat, danger, black boys coming across the street. Without even thinking, his hand goes to the switch. Meanwhile, you heard the work he's doing, right? So again, there's very little correlation, studies have shown, between our conscious values and unconscious bias. So what's at play? We're primed over and over again in our society, in the media, in the messages we receive about who people are, That priming leads us to make associations in our brain, right? Literally neural pathways in our brain. And those associations lead us to make assumptions about categories of people unconsciously. What's at play here? What are the messages of these billboards? Call it out if you would. What's the message here? Sex, what else? Latin lovers. Say it again. Alcohol. All right. Stereotypes about Latinas and Latinos. Sexualizing Latinos and Latinas, objectifying them. Now, we may drive by signs like this or see this in magazines and not have any consciousness of that subtext. We may or may not, but the fact of the matter is we're absorbing those messages. And we know that people of color and women are portrayed in negative and dehumanizing ways in the media at a much higher rate. And the messages underneath that portrayal, whether it's explicit or not, are that people of color are involved in crime. If you turn on your local news, which I don't do for this reason, and I don't turn it on with my children around, is because all you see, right, are images of people of color committing crimes. They're poor, they're on drugs, they're lazy. There's all these implicit and explicit messages in the news media and in social media and television that our brains are absorbing, whether we choose to absorb it or not. So the messaging is happening, whether it's conscious or not, and those are producing associations. So this is a pool safety public service announcement that came out from the Red Cross last summer. What do you notice? Who's cool?
Look at that.
White kids? Yeah. Apparently the white kids are cool at the pool. Who's not cool? Every single brown kid. Brown kids apparently push kids into the pool, right? They run. You're not supposed to run at the pool. And it's only the brown kids who do that. Now, how do you think that happened? How did that go out from the American Red Cross last summer? Was it conscious? Maybe, maybe not. But how many people reviewed that before it went to national publication and weren't conscious of what they were looking at and sent it on? And then how many young people looked at it, and whether they were conscious or not, what did they absorb from that message? Now, the Red Cross took that down almost immediately. That was, I don't know if some of you may have seen it, but it got called out very quickly and taken down. But the fact is that happens, and it happens at an unconscious level if we're not super vigilant about the negative messages that we have absorbed. So we're primed, and racial stereotypes are reinforced as a result also of the structural arrangements that we talked about yesterday and that we heard about a fair amount from our speakers yesterday, that we have an unnatural set of conditions in our communities where we have neighborhoods that have experienced decades of disinvestment and neighborhoods that we call high opportunity neighborhoods where investment has flowed in. And what happens then, the way that those unnatural structural arrangements reinforce the negative stereotypes is that if you can imagine young people going to school in the top picture, they are likely going to a school that's underfunded. They probably have teachers who are not as experienced. They don't have as many materials. The school may not be as welcoming to their parents. They may not have any green space. And then when the kids don't perform, if we don't have a structural analysis, our unconscious mind can say, something's wrong with those kids. All those kids over there in those schools, they don't act right, and they're not performing. If we're not consciously catching that. Likewise, we can think that kids who live in neighborhoods like the one in the bottom are somehow, they actually are just smarter or more committed to school. So the structural arrangements of our communities and the historic racism reinforces the implicit bias.
So we want to give a couple more examples of associations and how associations are powerful for for contributing to what happens with implicit bias. So this is a media image after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina hit through. And in case you can't see it or see it clearly, the top photo is an African-American person, and the bottom are white residents. And here's what happened with the headlines from the news, what you see in the news magazines here. They said this. They didn't put the ethnicity. We added that for emphasis. A young black man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. That's connected to the top image. The bottom one was this. 2 white residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. Now, these were in the same publication at the same time, just like this, except they didn't have the words black or the words white residents. So how are we primed? How are we making associations? How is the media influencing that? That's an example. There are other examples of associations that we make. So we make associations about certain people. Look at the associations here. What associations do you make of these two? Right? So the associations are powerful for us. And if we want to make the associations, we have to make the associations visible in order for us to do something about them. So we know that implicit bias connected to that, it kicks in before we are aware of it. Our examples are examples of implicit bias kicking in before we are aware of it. And it happens through the building of those synapses. Remember that picture of the synapse. Over and over and over again, I am fed, you are fed, our brains are fed, the images that produce the synapses, the messages that produce the synapses that then produce the behavior, and it results on some autopilot, like my finger going to the switch, but it also produces some autopilot that is life-threatening. When we see what happens in some cases with law enforcement in some of our communities, there's autopilot that is going on there, right? So we want to notice that when we see who gets sent to the office for discipline in schools, there's autopilot going on there. That's part of our unconscious awareness that stems from some of the associations that we have made. So we know that the mind is doing this coding, and our unconscious is doing the decision making. Right? Just like we talked about walking through the trail, our unconscious is doing the decision making, largely invisible to us. And our goal is to make it visible. So one of the ways that has happened is that this is an example a number of years ago. I think it started with the Philadelphia Philharmonic, where the community said, we do not understand why the orchestra is all men. And at that time, the orchestra was all men. And the answer from the leaders in the orchestra were, well, we do auditions and we just can't find any qualified women musicians. So someone had the idea that what we ought to do is do auditions behind a screen and see what happens. So they did auditions behind a screen. And in the first round of doing that, they noticed that things didn't change, that they still had more men, almost all men were selected for the orchestra and no women. And then somebody realized that when they were doing the auditions behind the screen, they were doing it on a stage with a wooden platform, with a wooden floor. And guess what? The women had to walk across that, everybody did, in order to sit down and do auditions. Well, guess what they heard? The shoes. So they put a carpet down and did the auditions again. And within one round, the orchestra went from 0% women to 50% women in one round.
Okay.
What's at play there? Implicit bias was deeply associated to what was going on, right? Do this one.
So again, with the brain, there have been studies done that have shown that people have greater empathy for people in what is perceived as the in group than the out group. And they have done fMRIs of the brain that have shown that when people are shown images of a white hand and a needle being put into that white hand, the parts of the brain that indicate empathy light up. When they're shown a picture of a black hand and a needle is put in, the parts of the brain don't light up as much. And that's true even for African American people looking at the image. So what that is reflecting and what has been shown in study after study is that there is a pro-white bias that we all have absorbed unconsciously. It's not that we're walking around consciously feeling or stating that, but unconsciously that has happened. And some of you may be familiar with the implicit association test. And that test, when done over and over again, has shown there is a negative black bias and a pro-white bias that lives in our brains. And we have to confront that because there are things we can do about it. So a few of the ways that plays out, though, is that in Colorado, there was a study done of healthcare providers. And the study showed that there was very little explicit bias toward African American and Latino patients. People were really happy about that. However, there was a high level of implicit bias when they were tested using the implicit association test. So how does that play out? One of the biases that was found among physicians was that physicians had an implicit bias that African American patients were less likely to adhere to medical guidance and less likely to follow doctor's orders, so to speak. And so how did that play out? African Americans were less likely to get organ transplants, fewer full joint replacements. And again, this is not consciously happening, but the data showed that that was happening. Women with heart disease are less likely to receive angioplasty and twice as likely to die as men if they're having a heart attack. And we talked about that yesterday with the ambulances. Ambulances, for some reason, take longer to get women who are having a heart attack to the hospital than men. And it's not because they're taking a different road, right? What assumptions do we make about women and women's pain compared to men's pain? Right? Drama. Latinos receive less pain medication during cancer treatment and during childbirth. And African Americans with diabetes are more likely to be amputated than diabetic whites. So these are serious, serious outcomes of these implicit biases. All right, bad news. We can't avoid absorbing all these categories because we have a history. Our country has begun with systemic oppression and we live with systemic oppression. So we can't avoid taking in all the messages that permeate the media and television in our communities because our brains are naturally categorizing and meaning making. So that's the bad news. Here's the promising news. Biases are malleable. We can influence our unconscious bias. We can build new mental associations, new synapses. And we can work to become more conscious of how biases operate in us and how they show up then in our decision making. So this is Marion Diamond. She actually died just last week. She was a pioneering neuroscientist who was the first to show that the brain could change as an adult with experience in enrichment. She actually studied Einstein's brain and saw differences in his brain that were the result of enrichment and experience, and then did studies on rats that showed with different kinds of stimulation, the brain could change at all ages. As a woman, though, and this was in the 80s, when she presented her initial research, she was presenting to largely white men, scientists, and when she presented, there was a man who literally stood up and said, "Young lady, that brain cannot change." So the good news is she respectfully disagreed and carried on with her work at UC Berkeley and could actually be seen walking around campus with a brain. So Hugh asked me, why does she have that brain in her hand? I said, because she literally carried it around. She studied the brain and showed us that, and brought up to the fore the concept of plasticity, that our brains can change. Your brains have all changed right there when you did the color activity. And we can be conscious about what are those neural pathways that we want to build and be intentional about that with the idea that cells that fire together, wire together.
So we're going to close in a moment, but we want to go through a strategy that helps us look at one strategy for how we can change our brains. Now, you see strategy number 3 up here. It's not because we misnumbered it. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at 4, and this is the number 3 strategy. This is about creating new narratives. We're producing new synapses in our mind as we do this. So I want you to call out to yourself, call out aloud. What's the new narrative here with Latinos in schooling? Name it. Call it out quickly. New narrative. Say it. Because if you say it aloud,
Graduates.
you produce a synapse.
Latinos
by
graduate.
saying it aloud. What's the new narrative about these young people, young African Americans in school? Holler it out. The new narrative. You're creating a new pathway when you say it. What's the new narrative about these young people of color, these kids in school? Scientists, smart, engaged. What's the new narrative about these young African American kids? Studying, inspired readers.
Love to read.
Right? You're forming new pathways. What's the new narrative? This is like the word test and the colors. We have to be able to see the new narrative even here. What is it? Potential. Potential.
Graduate student.
Worked hard and taken a break. What else? Fashion forward. All right. Close it out.
All right. Closing quote here. And Dr. Banerjee worked on the implicit association test. Implicit biases come from culture. I think of them as the thumbprint of culture on our minds. Human beings have the ability to learn to associate two things together very quickly. That is innate. What we teach ourselves and what we choose to associate is up to us. Thank you.